The wind sweeps across the barren landscape, carrying with it nothing but silence and dust. Today, the land looks empty, just rolling fields of grass, cracked soil, and trees that creak like ancient bones. But a century and a half ago, this place was alive. People walked these roads, children laughed in the streets, doors opened to the smell of bread baking, and horses stamped impatiently outside the general store. A town stood here, ordinary on the surface, unremarkable to anyone passing by. And then, in the year 1872, it was gone. Not destroyed by fire, not swallowed by flood, not abandoned after a slow decline. It erased itself, as if by decision, by pact, by something whispered in the dark. A settlement, wiped from the maps, its name scratched out of official records, leaving behind nothing but rumor and the faintest scars on the earth. Most towns fade away in predictable ways. Mines collapse, railroads change routes, fortunes vanish, and families move on. Across America, you can find hundreds of ghost towns, empty shells, relics of ambition and ruin. But this one is different. It didn't simply die. It vanished deliberately, with an unsettling precision, like a patient surgeon cutting a name out of history. And if you listen closely to the stories that remain, you'll hear echoes of why. Shadows of strange gatherings in the night, whispers of silence that seemed thicker than air, of secrets so dark that the only solution was disappearance. This is not just the story of a forgotten settlement. It is the story of a place that chose to forget itself. To tell this tale, we must step back into a different America. It was the aftermath of the Civil War, a country bruised and divided, struggling to stitch itself together. Families traveled westward in search of peace, wealth, or simply escape. New towns appeared like fragile flowers on the frontier, each one hoping to grow into permanence. Some succeeded, many didn't. But here, in this quiet corner, a settlement grew in isolation, far from the tracks of the railroad, far from the notice of state authorities. For a time, it thrived. For a time, it seemed stable. And then, in 1872, silence. A silence so complete that it feels less like history and more like erasure. But who decides when a town ceases to exist? Normally, it's nature, poverty, or time. Yet the records of this community didn't simply stop, they were stripped away. Maps once marked its name, and then, just as quickly, cartographers scratched it out, leaving behind blank space. County archives that should hold deeds, births, and deaths suddenly close the book, mid-sentence. It is as if someone, or something, insisted the town no longer be remembered. And perhaps, the most chilling thought of all, maybe the people themselves insisted on it. There are stories, of course. Every disappearance breeds them. Some say disease swept through, an epidemic so virulent, the survivors burned their homes to halt its spread and fled without looking back. Others whisper of massacre, a bloody night of violence carried out by outsiders, or perhaps insiders, that left too many dead for memory to bear. But among the darkest rumors are those that speak not of tragedy from without, but corruption from within. A belief that the townsfolk had made a collective choice, binding themselves together in secrecy, erasing their past, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because what they had been a part of was too shameful, too dangerous, or too forbidden to leave behind for others to find. When we think of places lost to history, we imagine ruins, crumbling walls, weather-beaten signs, and broken headstones. Here, there are almost none. What remains is absence, a gap in geography, a silence in records, a haunting in folklore. The land itself feels untouched, yet unsettled, as though the ground remembers what the archives deny. Travelers have long remarked on a sense of unease when crossing it, a feeling of being watched, of hearing voices that vanish when the wind dies down. Children in neighboring towns were once warned not to wander near, told tales of strange lights, of apparitions walking in quiet processions at dusk. Parents called them bedtime stories, but children noticed the way adults grew quiet whenever the subject arose, as though speaking too much of this place could call something back. So why did the town erase itself? And what truth hides beneath the layers of silence? Over the next journey into its story, we will sift through the scraps left behind, half-burned letters, contradictory maps, the folklore of frightened neighbors, and the thin whispers of descendants who claim to know why their ancestors disappeared. What we find will not be certainty. Instead, we will confront something more unsettling, the possibility that forgetting was the point, that the act of erasure was the town's final message, a warning written in silence. This is not a story about the westward expansion, or about the ordinary rise and fall of a frontier town. This is a story about collective memory, about secrets buried so deep that even history itself conspired to look away. It is about the thin line between survival and damnation, about how far people will go to protect themselves from the gaze of outsiders, or perhaps from something far more sinister. When the year 1872 closed, this town closed with it, and yet even in absence it lingers, in silence it speaks. They called it by a name now lost to us, a name scrubbed from maps and archives, but in the mid-19th century, that name carried hope. To settlers weary from endless roads and broken promises, it whispered of stability, of a place where roots could finally take hold. The town's beginnings were ordinary, as so many are. Families pushed westward in wagons, hauling with them everything they owned, quilts stitched by hand, iron stoves, keepsakes from a life left behind. The Civil War had scarred the nation, left homes shattered and farmlands burned. For many, the only choice was to move on, and this patch of earth, though remote, offered something that felt like opportunity. The town began humbly, with log cabins rising against the tree line and smoke curling from chimneys. The first building was not a saloon or a general store, but a church rough-hewn, drafty, its floorboards creaking under the weight of sermons about salvation and new beginnings. In time, a schoolhouse followed, then a blacksmith's forge, a mill, and finally the indispensable store where flour, sugar, and coffee could be traded. Life was hard, as it was everywhere. Winters bit into the land with a cruelty that cracked the soil. Summers baked it until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Yet people endured. They planted crops, they raised cattle, they held dances in barns lit by oil lamps. By all accounts, it was a real town, modest but alive. But from the very beginning, there was something different. Travelers who passed through often remarked that it felt quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with isolation, but something else. A hush that settled over the streets, even during daylight, as though the town collectively held its breath. Newcomers often didn't stay long. Some spoke of feeling unwelcome, of cold eyes watching them from doorways, of conversations that would stop abruptly the moment they entered a room. One merchant, who tried to establish a trading post nearby, described the community as clannish, like they lived by rules not shared with outsiders. He left within weeks. Still, the town had structure. Its economy depended on farming and small-scale trade. The soil was stubborn but workable, and those who stayed seemed determined to make it yield. Livestock grazed on the edges of the settlement, children carried buckets from the creek, and wagons rolled in with goods from distant markets. For a time, the town prospered just enough to seem permanent. But permanence on the frontier was an illusion. Disease could arrive on a single breath, bandits could ride in without warning, and crops could fail overnight. Yet in this case, survival was not ended by misfortune. It was ended by something deeper. Religious fervor often burned brightly in frontier towns. Cut off from the great cities, communities leaned heavily on faith for order, for identity, for meaning. In this town, faith was not just central, it was everything. Sermons stretched for hours, hymns carried late into the night, and townsfolk were known to gather not only on Sundays, but on weeknights, assembling long after lamps should have been extinguished. Outsiders reported strange songs, words not drawn from familiar scripture, echoing from the fields. Some dismissed it as rumor, others began to whisper about heresy, about practices that seemed less like Christianity and more like something older, something harder to name. Yet in daily life, the town appeared wholesome. Children recited lessons from slate boards, Farmers plowed fields in straight lines, women hung washed to dry in the wind. But beneath the rhythm of frontier living was an undercurrent, one difficult to describe yet impossible to ignore. Visitors said the townsfolk spoke in a certain way, finishing each other's sentences, pausing in unison, as though connected by an unseen thread. Strangers felt they were not meeting individuals, but a single body moving with many hands and voices. Despite the whispers, the town attracted enough settlers to maintain its numbers. It grew slowly, never sprawling, but building a sense of permanence. Wooden fences marked boundaries, gravestones began to dot the cemetery hill, and the roads bore the tracks of wagons coming and going. But the deeper one looks at this history, the more one realizes how little evidence survives. Records that should exist, property deeds, birth and death certificates, tax rolls, have vanished. In their place are second-hand accounts, stray letters from travelers, and the oral traditions of neighboring communities, who spoke of the town with a mixture of curiosity and unease. There is one striking consistency: nearly every outsider describes the same feeling, an invisible barrier, a sense of being tolerated rather than welcomed. It was as though the town had been built not for growth, but for itself, self-contained and self-sufficient. The people wanted no part of the outside world, and perhaps in return, the world decided it would have no part of them. And yet, for those who lived there, it was home, a place where children were born, where marriages were celebrated, where crops were harvested under the relentless sun, a place where the townsfolk must have felt the deep comfort of familiarity, the illusion that what they were building could last forever. That illusion would soon crumble, but in the years before 1872, the town stood as a curious contradiction, ordinary in appearance, yet unsettling in spirit. A settlement that should have blended into the hundreds of others across the frontier, but instead carried with it the quiet seed of something darker. Every town has its birth. This one was born of hope, shaped by survival, and shadowed from the start by a strangeness its people could neither explain nor escape. The silence of its streets, the unity of its voices, the rumors of its night gatherings, all of these things became part of its identity. And as the years crept forward, these peculiarities would grow, not fade. In time, they would define the community, drawing its people closer together and pushing the rest of the world away. By the time 1872 arrived, the town's fate was sealed. What began as a promise of a new life on the frontier would end as something far stranger, a deliberate erasure, a decision to vanish into silence. The 1870s were a decade of transition, a time when the United States was learning how to live with its scars. The Civil War had ended just a few years before, but its consequences lingered like smoke after a fire. Veterans returned home to broken towns, widows struggled to feed children, and entire regions bore the weight of grief and suspicion. Reconstruction was underway in the South, but in the Western territories and frontier states, another kind of struggle consumed daily life: survival. The frontier in the 19th century was not the romantic expanse of popular imagination. It was brutal, lawless, and unpredictable. Towns rose up overnight, born from rumors of gold, fertile soil, or river trade, and just as quickly they disappeared. A drought, a band of raiders, or the collapse of a single mineshaft could turn a bustling community into a wasteland. In that sense, ghost towns were not unusual. They dotted the landscape like broken teeth. But almost all of them left something behind: a trail of paper in county courthouses, faded mentions in newspapers, or a lonely signpost still clinging to a forgotten road. What makes the case of this vanished settlement so chilling is not that it died, but that it seems to have chosen to disappear. To understand just how strange that is, we must first grasp what life on the American frontier was truly like. Imagine endless miles of wilderness, forests stretching into silence, prairies vast enough to swallow a man whole. Law was thin in these places, and often it arrived too late. Justice was carried out with a rifle or a rope. The local sheriff, if there was one at all, was more a figure of compromise than of order. Outlaws found easy refuge in isolated settlements, and vigilante groups formed in response, blurring the line between protection and tyranny. Disease too was ever present. Cholera, smallpox, diphtheria. They traveled with the people, spreading from wagon trains to settlements, leaving death in their wake. A town could be healthy one week and burying dozens the next. It is no wonder then that some historians have speculated that epidemic was the true culprit behind the town's disappearance. And yet, when compared to similar tragedies, this one stands apart. Epidemics leave traces, mass graves, records of sudden deaths, desperate letters written to relatives in safer places. Here, those traces are missing. Another constant of frontier life was instability. Families often relocated multiple times, following rumors of better soil or better fortune. When towns collapsed, they usually did so slowly, shedding people in waves until only a skeleton population remained. But in the year 1872, this particular community did not decline gradually. It was erased abruptly, almost overnight. Its name removed from maps, its records deliberately destroyed, as though someone or everyone wanted no trace left behind. There is something deeply unsettling about this when placed against the backdrop of the 19th century. For many Americans, the act of founding a town was more than survival, it was legacy. These were people who wanted to be remembered, who wanted their families' names carved into the story of a nation expanding westward. To erase a town's existence was to betray that desire. It was to say, we do not wish to be remembered at all. That kind of collective silence does not come without cause. This silence becomes even more disturbing when we compare it to other examples of lost communities. The most famous is, of course, the Roanoke colony, which vanished nearly 3 centuries earlier, leaving behind only the word Croatoan carved into a tree. In Roanoke's case, the mystery persisted precisely because fragments remained. Archaeologists could dig, historians could speculate. But here the absence is sharper. No single clue left etched into wood, no single word scratched into stone. Instead, an obliteration so thorough it feels orchestrated. The environment of the 1870s also provided fertile ground for secrecy. Newspapers circulated, but slowly. News could take weeks or months to travel from one settlement to another. Government oversight was weak, and in many frontier regions, nearly non-existent. If a town decided to vanish, if its people agreed, by necessity or by pact, they could do so without much difficulty. All it would take was silence, silence in letters, silence in trade, silence in records. In time, the world would stop asking questions, but the question we must ask is why? What force, what fear could drive an entire community to willingly blot itself from history? Was it shame? Was it something they had done, or was it something they believed had been unleashed among them, something they could not risk passing on to the world beyond their borders? The folklore surrounding the town suggests that outsiders sensed something unusual long before 1872. Visitors described an atmosphere of unease, as though every household kept secrets too heavy to speak. Some hinted at strange gatherings in fields after nightfall, gatherings that did not sound like worship as most knew it. There were reports of chanting, of fires burning in circles, of children kept awake by sounds they could not understand. These accounts might have been exaggerated, frontier gossip often was, but in light of the town's disappearance, they take on a darker resonance. Even more chilling is the possibility that erasure was not simply an act of forgetting, but of protection. Some descendants of neighboring communities, interviewed many decades later, recalled their grandparents speaking in hushed tones. They claimed the townsfolk had sworn an oath, a pact to keep their story buried. If true, then their silence was not only about covering shame, but about shielding the outside world from knowledge of what they had done, or what they had discovered. And so we return to the paradox of the vanished town. In a century marked by upheaval, loss and constant change, its disappearance was not just another casualty of history. It was something deliberate. In the silence of the archives and the emptiness of the land, there is intent. The kind of intent that sends chills down the spine, because intent means choice. Someone, or everyone, chose to erase this place. And in that choice lies a deeper, more frightening mystery, than any plague or massacre could explain. When we step back and view the 19th century in all its violence and fragility, we see patterns of destruction, towns swallowed by floods, towns consumed by fire, towns starved by drought. But in this case, we see something else, an act of collective disappearance, orchestrated in a time when secrecy was easy, but rarely so complete. The town's vanishing was not an accident. It was an event, one that left nothing behind but whispers, rumors, and the heavy silence of unanswered questions. Stories about the town did not vanish when its name disappeared from maps. Instead, they transformed into whispers, rumors passed down in the dark corners of saloons, in hushed tones around campfires, in the fearful lullabies of parents warning children not to wander too far. These whispers spoke of things no census or county record would dare describe. They spoke of rituals. In every community, religion shaped daily life, and on the frontier, it was often the only thing holding people together. But in this town, faith seemed to grow in strange directions. Travelers spoke of sermons that stretched long into the night, of prayers spoken in unison, not with the fervor of worship but with the discipline of rehearsal. Outsiders who happened to pass through claimed they had heard chants carried across the fields, phrases that did not belong to any scripture they knew, sounds that seemed closer to rhythm than to words. Some dismissed it as superstition, nothing more than wind whistling across the prairie. Yet the stories persisted. One tale, retold by a passing preacher decades later, described seeing the townsfolk gathered in a circle outside the church well after midnight. Each held a lantern, and their faces glowed with an intensity that unsettled him. He insisted they were singing in a language he did not recognize, their voices blending in eerie harmony that rose and fell with mechanical precision. He did not stay until the end. He left before dawn, and when asked years later why he never returned, he answered simply, "It wasn't meant for strangers to hear." Symbols, too, became part of the folklore. Carvings etched into fence posts, strange markings scratched on the inside of barns, shapes that looked more like spirals and stars than anything a farmer would need to tally crops or brand animals. These signs never appeared in any official record, of course, but scattered testimonies suggest they were real. Children from nearby settlements claimed they saw them while sneaking into town to play dares, only to be chased away by men carrying torches. Whether those symbols were remnants of superstition, secret codes, or something far older is impossible to prove. But their very existence fueled suspicions that what happened here was more than just ordinary religious devotion. Folklorists often say that when a community turns inward, legends grow like weeds. Isolation breeds not only secrecy but imagination, and outsiders will always fill the silence with the stories they fear most. But what is striking about this town's folklore is how consistent the details are. From scattered accounts across decades, the same images emerge: gatherings at night, chants rising like smoke, symbols etched into wood and stone. Even the most skeptical historian cannot ignore how these threads weave into a tapestry of unsettling continuity. And then there are the stories of the children. According to rumor, children in the town were kept under strange rules. They were not allowed to speak certain words, not permitted to wander after sundown. Some claimed the children were taught special songs, melodies not found in hymnals, which they sang only within the safety of their community. Outsiders remembered hearing them hum while fetching water at the creek. A traveling school teacher once remarked that the children seemed distant, disciplined, as though they had already learned how to hold secrets. Perhaps most disturbing are the tales of processions. These were said to take place when the moon was hidden, nights when the sky was utterly dark. Townsfolk would march in silence, single file, holding candles that bobbed like floating stars. No words, no music, only the soft crunch of boots across dirt. Witnesses described the eerie sight of an entire town moving together, a living organism with one will. No one knew where the processions ended. Some claimed they led to the cemetery hill. Others believed they wound deep into the forest, vanishing into the trees. Of course, it is easy to dismiss all of this as folklore, the inevitable embroidery of rumor layered over an otherwise ordinary town. Frontier communities were often accused of strange practices by jealous rivals or nervous neighbors. Fear of the unknown always sharpened into stories of witchcraft, devil worship, or secret societies. But here the difference lies in the town's ultimate fate. When a settlement disappears so completely, every rumor suddenly feels heavier, every whisper more sinister. It forces us to ask, were these really just tales or fragments of truth that survived the erasure? Some folklorists suggest the rituals were nothing more than a distorted reflection of religious zeal. In a time when revivalist preachers stirred crowds into trances, when speaking in tongues was seen as a divine gift, the line between holy and unholy blurred easily. What one person experienced as spiritual ecstasy, another might describe as possession. Perhaps the townsfolk were simply more fervent, more united, more desperate for divine favor than their neighbors could understand. But if that were the case, why erase the evidence? Why blot out even the town's name? And then there is the darker interpretation, the possibility that their rituals were never meant to honor the divine, but something else. Symbols that do not match scripture, chants without words, processions into the night. These are not the hallmarks of ordinary worship. They sound like the bones of something older, something borrowed from traditions buried beneath centuries of folklore. A community cut off from the outside world could easily weave fragments of such practices into their daily lives, until faith became indistinguishable from ritual, and ritual from secrecy. What matters most is how these whispers framed the town in the imagination of others. It was no longer simply another settlement struggling against the wilderness. It became, in the eyes of those who heard the rumors, a place apart, a place where the ordinary rules of faith, community, and life itself bent into unfamiliar shapes. And when it vanished in 1872, those whispers only deepened. For in the absence of proof, folklore becomes truth. So much of what we know about the vanished town comes not from official documents, but from stories carried forward in hushed tones. And while we cannot prove the rituals, the symbols, or the processions, we cannot dismiss them either. Folklore, after all, is not about facts, it is about memory, and sometimes memory preserves what history cannot. In this case, memory preserves the image of a community bound together not just by hardship or survival, but by something far stranger, something that might explain why, in the end, the town chose silence over remembrance. The year was 1872. In the history of the vanished town, it stands as the final chapter, though the way it closed is unlike anything most historians, folklorists, or storytellers have ever seen. It was the year when silence descended, when the town's name slipped from documents, when neighbors looked west and found only emptiness where once there had been smoke rising from chimneys. What happened in those 12 months has been debated, reconstructed, and mythologized, but the truth remains elusive, as though it too was erased alongside the town itself. At the start of 1872, the town appeared to live much as it always had. Farmers plowed fields, the school bell rang to call children inside, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out against iron in the cool morning air. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss, yet scattered accounts from travelers hint that something beneath the surface was shifting. A trader passing through in early spring noted in his diary that the townsfolk seemed watchful, more unified than before, as if rehearsing for something. He could not place what unsettled him, but he did not linger. By summer, the changes became more visible. Neighboring communities began to notice that fewer wagons were leaving the town. Trade slowed. The usual movement of people, farmers delivering grain, women buying cloth, children visiting relatives, dwindled. When outsiders approached, they were met with guarded stares. Some were turned away outright. Letters that once traveled between this settlement and others ceased altogether. By July, it was as though a wall of silence had been built around the town, not of stone or wood, but of will. Then came the reports, small, fragmentary, unsettling. A farmer from a neighboring village claimed that while herding cattle at dusk, he saw an eerie procession on the ridge, dozens of lanterns moving in perfect synchronization, vanishing into the trees. A stagecoach driver swore he passed the outskirts one evening and saw no lights, no smoke, no movement, though the town had been thriving only weeks before. And yet when he rode back the next day, life appeared normal again, as if nothing had changed. These contradictory accounts only deepen the mystery, as if the town existed in two states at once, living and already gone. By autumn, the silence grew heavier. Newspaper archives from nearby counties, which once mentioned the settlement, occasionally in notices of trade or births, stopped referencing it entirely. Census takers preparing their records found gaps. Maps that had listed the town only the year before began to appear without its name. Some were corrected versions, others freshly printed. The erasure was swift, almost mechanical. What could drive such precision? Epidemic is one possibility. The 19th century was plagued with waves of cholera and smallpox, diseases that could devastate small communities. Survivors often burned homes and belongings to stop contagion. But in this case there are no records of mass graves, no urgent letters describing sudden sickness, no signs of neighboring settlements being infected. The absence of evidence is not proof, but it is suspicious. Another theory is massacre. The frontier was a violent place. Raiders, bandits, and conflict with native tribes often erupted in bloodshed. If the town had been attacked, perhaps its remains were erased to hide the brutality, to spare families elsewhere from despair. Yet once again, no records remain. Neighboring settlements, who usually documented raids with obsessive detail, say nothing. Silence again. It is this silence, louder than any battle, that chills the bones. Then there is the possibility of collective exodus. Some whisper that in 1872, the townsfolk followed a charismatic leader into the wilderness, abandoning their homes to seek a promised land. Religious movements of the era were known for such migrations, sects that believed the world was ending, or that salvation lay somewhere far beyond civilization. In this interpretation, the erasure was self-inflicted, the town blotting itself out as it marched toward a new destiny. And yet, if this were true, where did they go? No new settlement appears in the records. No trail of families surfaces under a different name. They vanished without a trace, as though swallowed whole by the very earth. One of the most enduring rumors, however, ties back to the strange rituals whispered about in earlier decades. Folklore claims that in 1872, the town held one final gathering, a midnight meeting where every man, woman, and child assembled. No one outside the community witnessed what happened, but neighboring farmers swore they saw an orange glow in the sky that lasted until dawn, as if a massive fire burned without consuming. When morning came, the town was empty. Some insist the people had offered themselves in sacrifice, a ritual erasure of body and spirit. Others believe they had sealed a pact, one that demanded silence and disappearance. These are stories without proof, but the very fact that they exist speaks to how strongly the town's mystery gripped those who lived nearby. As winter closed over the land, the absence became undeniable. Travelers who once stopped at the inn found the doors locked. The general store shelves stood empty, dust already gathering. Farmhouses, once alive with the smell of wood smoke, now sat cold and dark. Animals wandered untended, fences sagged, fields went to seed. It was not just abandonment, it was abandonment by design, as though everything had been left in a single moment. No gradual decline, no signs of panic, just absence. By the end of 1872, the town's name had been stripped from maps. County clerks, when questioned, offered vague explanations. Some claimed clerical error. Others shrugged and said simply, "That town doesn't exist anymore." And in the silence of their responses lies something more disturbing than any single tragedy, the implication that the erasure was not just accepted, but enforced. The following years only deepened the void. Where a paper trail should exist, there is nothing. Where oral histories should recall names and dates, there are only fragmented whispers. A place that had lived, breathed, and raised generations had, within the span of 1 year, become a hole in history. For those who sought answers, the year 1872 became less a date and more a symbol, the moment when a community chose or was forced to vanish. The question remains, what truly happened in that fateful year? Was it plague, massacre, migration, or something darker? Perhaps we will never know. But what we can say with certainty is this: 1872 marked the death not of a town but of its memory. And that, more than anything, is what unsettles us. For when memory is erased, when silence replaces fact, imagination fills the void, and imagination often conjures terrors far greater than truth. A year like any other on the calendars of history, but for one town it was the end of the story. Or perhaps, the beginning of one that still haunts the land today. History usually leaves a trail. Even when towns collapse, there are always scraps, census lists, faded ledgers, yellowing birth certificates tucked into courthouse files. A ghost town might lose its people, but it rarely loses its paper. The land itself, after all, was owned, bought, sold, taxed, and recorded. And yet, when researchers began looking for the vanished settlement after 1872, they found something stranger than ruins. They found silence. The absence of records is perhaps the most chilling clue of all. In county archives, where the town should appear alongside dozens of others, there is a void. Property deeds halt abruptly. Census records skip over the settlement, as though its families never existed. Even newspaper archives, which once mentioned the town in passing advertisements or trade notices, suddenly grow mute. This is not how history behaves naturally. History frays, it decays, it contradicts itself, but it rarely vanishes so completely. Some historians argue that the missing records are the result of fire. Courthouses of the 19th century were notorious for their flammability. One overturned lantern, one spark in a storage room, and decades of paperwork could go up in smoke. Fires did indeed claim many archives across the frontier, but in this case, the fire never happened. The courthouse in the nearest county still stands. Its records remain intact for neighboring settlements, every birth and death accounted for, except those tied to the erased town. It is as if a careful hand flipped through the ledgers and plucked out only the pages it wished to remove. The same eerie pattern extends to maps. Early cartographers marked the settlement confidently, plotting it beside rivers and wagon trails, but by the mid-1870s, its name was gone. On some maps, the space where it had been was left blank, as though nothing had ever existed there. On others, the land was redrawn with vague features, as if corrected by someone insisting the town was never real. When researchers compared editions side by side, they found the erasure precise, intentional, and consistent. The ink of its existence faded not by time, but by decision. Folklorists have a phrase for this phenomenon: the archival haunting. It refers to the peculiar dread that comes not from what history preserves, but from what it refuses to reveal. A burned record leaves ash, a missing record leaves only suspicion. And in this case, the suspicion deepens when one notices how deliberate the silences are. No neighboring towns lost their records. No other communities were erased from maps in the same way. Only this one. Even researchers in the 20th century, digging into dusty basements and forgotten library collections, described the sensation of doors closing. One local historian, interviewed in the 1960s, recalled how she requested files from the county clerk's office, only to be told the town was never registered. When she pressed further, she was met with a curt dismissal. "You won't find anything. Best to stop asking." Another researcher in the 1980s described how microfilm copies of old newspapers, which should have contained references to the settlement, had gaps where the town's name should have been. Entire columns blurred, as though deliberately smudged in reproduction. The possibility arises that the erasure was not an accident of history, but a decision of authority. Perhaps county officials conspired to cleanse the records, either to bury scandal or to honor the town's own request for oblivion. This raises unsettling questions. Who would have the power to demand such erasure? And why would officials comply? Bureaucracies, after all, are built on records. To remove them goes against the very instinct of government. Unless, of course, the alternative was considered more dangerous. Yet the silence was not perfect. Small traces slipped through. A diary belonging to a traveling salesman in 1871 describes the town by name, noting the peculiarity of its residents. A letter written by a mother to her daughter in 1872 mentions visiting the settlement west of the ridge and remarks on the unsettling quiet there. A single advertisement in a regional paper from 1870, still preserved, lists goods available in the town's name, a fragile remnant of a place determined to vanish. These fragments serve less as evidence than as ghosts, reminders that the town was once real, that its people did walk the earth, even if history now denies them. But the silence also deepens the folklore. Neighbors, unable to reconcile the lack of official memory, filled the void with rumor. They said the town had struck a bargain, that part of the pact required erasing themselves from history's gaze. Others claimed county officials ordered the erasure after discovering what the community had done, afraid that if the truth spread, it would shame or endanger the entire region. More superstitious whispers suggested that it was not men but the land itself that erased the records, as though the ground rejected remembrance, swallowing ink and parchment as surely as it swallowed the people. To investigate such silences is maddening. Researchers are left grasping at shadows, chasing footnotes that lead nowhere. Every absence feels intentional, every gap like a warning. In time, the silence itself becomes the story. Not what happened, but what is hidden. Not what is said, but what cannot be said. And perhaps that is the most terrifying possibility of all, that the erasure was not meant to deceive historians or silence neighbors, but to silence us, the future. That those who vanished in 1872 did so with such care, such precision, that we today are left with nothing but unease. Because to know what they did, or why they disappeared, might be more dangerous than ignorance. This is the paradox of the town's legacy. Its absence is louder than its presence ever was. In the archives, it is not a name we find, but a gap. In the maps, it is not a town we see but a blank space. And in the folklore, it is not certainty we inherit, but a whisper that grows darker with every generation. The silence of the archives is not empty. It is a silence full of intent, heavy with the weight of what was deliberately concealed. And in that silence, perhaps, lies the closest thing we have to the truth. When history fails to give us answers, the human mind begins to invent them. Silence breeds speculation, and speculation becomes theory. For the town that erased itself in 1872, theories are not merely academic, they are the lifeblood of its legend. Each possibility offers a fragment of truth, a shard of explanation, but none fit perfectly. Instead, they create a mosaic of dread, a puzzle with pieces missing. The first and most straightforward theory is epidemic. Disease stalked the 19th century with merciless regularity. Cholera outbreaks swept across states, sometimes claiming entire villages. Smallpox struck without mercy, often prompting communities to quarantine themselves in desperate attempts to survive. It is tempting to believe that the vanished town was another casualty of contagion, struck down in a single season. Yet the evidence falters. Epidemics leave trails, frantic letters, official decrees, warnings in local papers. Neighboring towns, terrified of infection, always recorded outbreaks meticulously. In this case, there is nothing. Not a single letter, not a single quarantine order, not a single death notice. If disease claimed the town, then it did so in complete silence, a silence that itself seems unnatural. Another theory casts the tragedy in the light of violence. The frontier was far from peaceful. Conflicts with native tribes, though often exaggerated in settler lore, were still a grim reality. Banditry and vigilante justice were rampant. Could the town have been wiped out in a sudden attack, its remains covered up by embarrassed officials? Perhaps. Yet here, too, the records betray us. Neighboring communities kept obsessive track of raids and skirmishes, often exaggerating them for sympathy or aid. A massacre of an entire town would have echoed loudly in newspapers and state records. The absence of any mention makes this theory difficult to sustain. A subtler version of violence theory suggests the town turned on itself. Some researchers believe internal conflict, perhaps a dispute over land, religion, or leadership, erupted into bloodshed. The survivors may have fled, abandoning the name of the settlement out of shame. This aligns with whispers of strange rituals and secret meetings. If the town had fractured, the erasure may have been an attempt to bury the memory of betrayal. Yet again, evidence is scarce. Oral tradition should at least carry fragments of such an event, but all that remains are hints and rumors, slippery as smoke. Perhaps the most tantalizing theory is mass exodus. Across the 19th century, charismatic leaders emerged, preaching visions of utopia in distant lands. Some convinced their followers to abandon homes and trek westward, promising paradise. Could the vanished town have done the same? The silence of records might suggest an intentional abandonment, a pact to leave no trace. And yet, if they migrated, where did they go? There is no new settlement that suddenly appeared with the same surnames, no census spike elsewhere, no wave of settlers claiming new land under a different name. To vanish without leaving a trail of new beginnings is almost as strange as disappearing entirely. This leads us to the most unsettling theory of all, that the erasure was intentional, not just of place but of identity. Folklore whispers of a ritual, a covenant, a decision made collectively by the townsfolk to remove themselves from history. One version claims they made a pact with forces older than Christianity, older than the frontier, to secure prosperity or protection, only to have the bargain turn against them. Another version suggests they sought transcendence, a belief that by erasing their earthly existence, they could ascend to a higher plane. In both cases, the ritual required not only their disappearance, but the obliteration of their memory. This would explain the eerie precision with which their records were removed, as though the pact itself reached into archives, blotting out their names. Skeptics dismiss such tales as superstition, born from fear of the unknown. But skeptics must also admit, people have done stranger things in the name of faith. Whole sects have marched into deserts, drowned themselves in rivers, starved in caves, all believing they were obeying divine command. Why not a town that chose to vanish into silence? One chilling anecdote, passed down through generations, gives this theory flesh. A farmer in a neighboring village claimed that on the final night of 1872, he saw a glow rising from the town's direction. It was not fire in the ordinary sense, but a steady orange light that lingered until dawn. When he rode to investigate days later, the town was gone, homes intact, but lifeless. It is easy to dismiss this as rural exaggeration, yet when placed alongside the missing records, the abandoned homes and the whispered rituals, it begins to sound less like fantasy and more like testimony. Another school of thought blames not faith but conspiracy. Some researchers suggest the town discovered something, an industrial secret, a mineral vein, or even evidence of corruption that made powerful men nervous. Erasing the town may have been the simplest way to bury a scandal. Companies in the 19th century were ruthless, governments often complicit. A few bribes, a few destroyed records, and a settlement could be wiped from maps as if it had never stood. If this were true, then the silence of the archives is not supernatural but political, a cover-up carried out with chilling efficiency. But if so, what secret could possibly justify the eradication of an entire community? Theories swirl like smoke because the core remains hollow. Each explanation carries weight, yet none answers every question. Epidemic explains the disappearance, but not the erasure. Violence explains the erasure, but not the absence of records. Migration explains the silence, but not the lack of a new home. Ritual explains the precision, but strains the limits of belief. Conspiracy explains the archives, but not the vanished lives. Each theory touches the truth, but none fully contains it. Perhaps that is why the legend endures. The vanished town does not give us one story, but many. It is a mirror for our fears, reflecting plague, violence, fanaticism, corruption, and the supernatural. In the absence of certainty, every possibility becomes plausible. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the town, in erasing itself, achieved what no settlement ever had. It became not a place but a riddle that continues to whisper from the margins of maps, daring us to solve it, knowing we never will. When history fails to answer, folklore steps in, and in the case of the vanished town, folklore has done more than step in. It has swallowed the silence whole. For every page torn from the archives, there are a dozen whispers around campfires, a dozen stories passed from parent to child, each bending truth into legend. These stories may not reveal what happened in 1872, but they reveal something equally powerful: how the human imagination fills the void with fear, mystery, and wonder. One of the earliest legends describes the town as cursed from the beginning. Locals claimed it was built on land that was never meant to be tamed, an ancient hunting ground or burial site whose spirits refused to be disturbed. Farmers spoke of stones that bled when struck by plows, of wells that turned dry overnight, of livestock born with strange deformities. Some said the very soil rejected the settlers, and that their disappearance was simply the land reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Another thread of folklore insists the townsfolk practiced strange rites long before 1872. Outsiders whispered of late-night gatherings in the woods, where voices rose in languages no one could recognize. Farmers in nearby villages claimed they saw bonfires on the ridge, shadows moving in unnatural patterns, shapes that seemed larger, taller than men. To some, these were nothing more than rumors born of suspicion toward outsiders. But to others, they were evidence of a community bound together not by faith or trade, but by something darker. The most enduring tale is the Night of Lanterns. According to oral tradition, sometime in the autumn of 1872, every household in the town lit a lantern and walked silently toward the woods. A procession of lights moved like a river of fire across the ridge, disappearing into the trees. None ever returned. Neighbors who saw it described the silence as more terrifying than the sight itself. No singing, no chanting, only footsteps and the steady glow of lanterns. The next morning, the town was empty. Some versions of the story say the lanterns were seen again years later, drifting through the woods, as if the townsfolk were doomed to walk forever, trapped between worlds. Haunting legends also cling to the abandoned land itself. Hikers in the early 20th century claimed to find crumbling foundations, but also heard inexplicable sounds, laughter carried on the wind, doors slamming in houses that no longer stood, children's voices calling from nowhere. Hunters reported strange stillness, as if the forest around the vanished settlement held its breath. A few even swore they saw entire buildings standing where none should be, only for them to vanish when approached. Such tales grew so common that the place became known as the town that hides itself, a spot on the map said to appear and disappear like a mirage. Local superstitions added new details with each retelling. Some believed the town had made a pact with the devil himself, trading their earthly existence for prosperity, only to have the debt come due in 1872. Others claimed the people were taken by the Watchers, shadowy figures said to move between worlds, seeking entire communities to consume. A particularly chilling story describes the sound of a church bell ringing in the distance on nights when fog rolls in thick over the valley, though no church remains. Listeners say it is the tolling of the town's final service, a reminder that its congregation still gathers, even in death. Folklore also painted individuals into the myth. One recurring figure is the widow in black, a woman said to have lost her husband and children before the town disappeared. She is described as wandering the outskirts, warning travelers not to enter. Accounts of her vary. Sometimes she is a grieving mother, other times a malevolent spirit luring the curious to their doom. In every version, she carries the weight of sorrow, embodying the grief of an entire community swallowed by silence. Ghost stories persist into the present day. Campers speak of waking to find footprints circling their tents, though no one had been there. Paranormal investigators claim to have captured voices on static recorders, muttering words that cannot be placed in English. One chilling piece of audio, circulated online, features a child's voice repeating a single word. Whether hoax or genuine, it aligns eerily with the folklore that the townsfolk still wander, forever searching for the place they once called their own. These legends do more than scare. They reveal how deeply the disappearance scarred the region's collective psyche. A vanished town is one thing, a vanished memory is another. Communities need stories to explain the unexplainable, and in the vacuum left by 1872, folklore became both shield and torch. It warned children away from the ruins, but also kept the memory alive when records would not. In this way, myth became archive, carrying fragments of truth within exaggeration. Historians tend to dismiss folklore as fantasy, yet sometimes in stories layered with superstition, there are kernels of fact. Processions with lanterns may have been real gatherings, misinterpreted by frightened neighbors. The glow seen in the sky could have been a mass fire to purge belongings in the wake of disease. Voices in the woods may be the echo of memory, projected by landscapes where trauma once occurred. Folklore distorts, but it rarely invents from nothing. And in the case of the vanished town, these distortions are all we have left. What makes the legends so unsettling is not just their content, but their persistence. Nearly 150 years have passed, and still the stories circulate. They appear in ghost tours, in whispered conversations, in online forums devoted to the paranormal. Travelers still report strange sensations when they wander too close to where the town once stood. Even in the age of satellites and digital maps, the land remains strangely blank, as if the erasure of 1872 still resists being undone. Folklore in this sense is not merely entertainment, it is resistance. It refuses to let the town vanish completely. It insists that something happened, even if no one can agree on what. It keeps alive the memory that officials' records and maps tried to bury. Whether ghostly or grotesque, whether whispered around campfires or repeated in paranormal documentaries, these stories ensure that the town's disappearance continues to haunt not only the land, but also the imagination. And perhaps that is the greatest haunting of all. Not the lanterns in the woods, not the widow in black, not the phantom church bell, but the haunting of uncertainty itself. The haunting of a mystery that refuses to die, no matter how many times it is erased. Folklore may keep the memory alive, but it is eyewitness testimony that keeps the fear real. As the 20th century unfolded, stories about the vanished town did not fade away, they multiplied. Farmers, hunters, travelers, and later, paranormal enthusiasts all reported strange encounters on or near the land where the town once stood. Their accounts vary in detail, but share a common thread: the sense of stepping into a place that should not exist, a place where the veil between past and present wears dangerously thin. The earliest known modern accounts date back to the 1910s, when hunters reported stumbling upon stone foundations deep in the woods. They found walls barely waist-high, arranged in patterns too orderly to be natural. One described a chimney standing alone, as though the house around it had melted away. What unsettled them more was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, as if the forest itself avoided the ruins. They left quickly and told few of what they saw, fearing ridicule. Yet their stories surfaced later in letters and local newspaper interviews, planting the first seeds of modern mystery. In the 1920s, a railroad worker claimed he saw smoke rising from the valley where the town had once stood. Curious, he hiked down, expecting to find a campfire. Instead, he swore he saw an entire settlement, houses intact, a church steeple rising above the trees, and people moving about in silence. He tried to approach, but as he descended, the image blurred and dissolved. When he reached the valley floor, there was nothing. Only grass, trees, and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. For years afterward, he refused to speak of it, until old age loosened his tongue. His testimony has since become one of the most cited phantom town sightings. The 1940s brought a new wave of stories, fueled by soldiers returning from war and restless youths exploring their surroundings. One group of teenagers, camping near the site in 1946, told of hearing a bell toll at midnight. They counted 12 clear strikes, but there was no church for miles and no town to ring it. Another claimed to see figures walking in the distance, each holding a lantern. They appeared in single file, moving steadily toward the woods, then vanished into the trees. The boys returned to their homes pale, shaken, unwilling to speak of it, except in whispers. By the mid-20th century, such stories had become part of regional law. Locals avoided the area at night. Farmers refused to buy land near the supposed site, claiming crops would fail or animals would sicken. A truck driver in the 1950s described driving through thick fog on a back road near the ridge, only to emerge on a dirt street lined with wooden houses. Men in old-fashioned clothes stared silently as he passed. Panicked, he floored the accelerator. When the fog cleared, the road was empty again, the houses gone. He never drove that route again. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of amateur paranormal investigators, emboldened by growing public interest in ghosts, UFOs and the occult. Groups began to visit the valley with cameras, tape recorders, and notebooks. Some reported hearing whispers in the static of their audio equipment, voices too faint to understand, but undeniably human. Others claimed their compasses spun wildly, refusing to point north. A few even reported losing time, as though hours had passed in minutes, their watches out of sync when they emerged. One investigator described a sudden overwhelming feeling of grief, so strong it brought him to his knees. He left the valley and never returned. The 1980s and 90s brought new kinds of witnesses, hikers, campers and thrill seekers, inspired by the growing fascination with ghost towns and dark history. Reports grew stranger. Some spoke of seeing children playing among ruins that weren't there, their laughter echoing unnaturally. Others swore they saw intact buildings in the distance, roofs, chimneys, even curtains fluttering in the windows, only for them to vanish when approached. A camper in 1992 described waking in the night to find footprints circling his tent, though no one else was present. He left at dawn and told his story only once, in a late-night radio call-in program, his voice shaking. Eyewitness accounts also extend into the digital age. Online forums and message boards are filled with posts from hikers who claim GPS devices malfunctioned in the valley, maps suddenly showing blank spaces or rerouting them in circles. Some uploaded blurry photographs, lights in the woods, shadowy figures, structures where none should exist. Skeptics dismiss them as hoaxes or pareidolia, the mind seeing patterns where none exist. But for believers, they are proof that the town still lingers, caught between existence and erasure. One of the most haunting testimonies comes from 2006, when a pair of college students camped near the supposed site. They brought video equipment, hoping to capture paranormal activity. Around midnight, their camera recorded faint lights moving in the trees. At first they assumed it was other campers, but the lights moved in unnerving patterns, swaying side to side, never breaking formation. Then came the audio, a low rhythmic hum, rising and falling like chanting. When the students shouted, the lights blinked out instantly. Their footage, uploaded online, went viral among paranormal communities. Skeptics insist the lights were fireflies or headlights, the sound distorted wind. But those who watch closely note the unnatural synchronization of the lights, and the way the hum seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. What makes these accounts chilling is not merely their detail, but their consistency. Decade after decade, generation after generation, the same motifs repeat. Lights in the woods, phantom buildings, tolling bells, silent figures. Even when separated by time and distance, witnesses describe eerily similar phenomena. This consistency suggests one of two possibilities. Either the legend has shaped the witness's imagination, or the legend is rooted in something real that continues to echo through the land. Skeptics argue that memory is malleable, that stories spread like infection, shaping how people interpret natural phenomena. Fog becomes ghostly smoke, ruins become phantom towns, deer with lantern-like eyes become spectral processions. And yet, skeptics cannot explain the deep unease felt even by those who do not believe. Travelers who know nothing of the legend often report the same sensations: silence too deep, air too heavy, time too strange. For them, the valley feels wrong, not haunted, but hollow like a wound in the landscape. These eyewitness accounts, scattered across a century, do not solve the mystery of the vanished town. But they do something just as powerful: they ensure the mystery cannot die. Every new sighting, Every new testimony adds fuel to the fire, keeping the legend alive. Whether hallucinations, hoaxes, or genuine glimpses into another reality, they remind us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting to be seen again, waiting to be heard. And in the case of this town, it seems determined never to rest. By the dawn of the 21st century, the vanished town had become more than folklore. It had become a challenge, a puzzle that dared to be solved. For historians, journalists, and paranormal investigators alike, the silence of the archives and the persistence of legends demanded answers. And so expeditions began. Some were driven by scholarship, others by sensation, but all carried the same hope: to peel back the layers of myth and uncover the truth of what happened in 1872. The first serious modern investigations began in the late 20th century, when local historians scoured county courthouses, church records, and private collections. They sought any scrap of evidence: marriage certificates, tax rolls, land deeds that could prove the town's existence. A handful of tantalizing fragments surfaced: a property sale recorded in 1869, a newspaper advertisement from 1870, a diary entry describing a visit in 1871. But when the timeline reached 1872, the trail went cold. It was as if every record from that year forward had been scrubbed clean. Some researchers suggested incompetence, others suspected deliberate tampering. Yet the deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered. Officials waved them off, insisting nothing had been erased. Archivists claimed no such town had ever existed, even when shown evidence to the contrary. The investigators began to feel not just stonewalled, but actively discouraged. In the 1990s and early 2000s, interest in the mystery expanded beyond academics. Independent filmmakers, journalists, and eventually online bloggers began to document their attempts to locate the town's remains. They hiked through valleys and forests, guided by old maps and oral tradition. What they found was often ambiguous: scattered stones that might have been foundations, depressions in the earth that could have been cellars, trees growing in straight rows where houses may once have stood. No intact ruins remained, no marker to definitively prove a settlement had ever been there. Yet the sense of absence was palpable. One documentary crew described how their audio equipment repeatedly malfunctioned near a particular ridge, their batteries draining as if consumed by an unseen force. Another journalist swore she heard voices echoing faintly on her microphone playback, though no one had spoken at the time of recording. Paranormal investigators, drawn by these stories, made the vanished town a recurring focus of their expeditions. Ghost hunting teams, armed with electromagnetic sensors, thermal cameras, and EVP recorders flocked to the site, hoping to capture definitive proof of the supernatural. Their findings were as eerie as they were inconclusive. Some claimed to record phantom footsteps, others swore they captured children's laughter on tape. One team in 2011 produced thermal images showing heat signatures shaped like human figures standing in the trees, though no one was physically present. Skeptics dismissed these as equipment errors, but for believers they were confirmation that the town's residents had never truly left. Meanwhile, academic researchers approached the mystery from a different angle. Geographers compared historical maps, noting the precise removal of the town's name after 1872. Linguists analyzed oral traditions, tracing how the stories evolved over generations. Psychologists studied eyewitness testimonies, exploring how memory and expectation shaped perception. Some concluded the town was simply abandoned and forgotten, its memory warped by myth. Others insisted the deliberate erasure of records pointed to a conspiracy. What none could explain was why this particular community was singled out, when countless other ghost towns left behind clear paper trails. Journalists covering the story often encountered hostility. One reporter from a regional newspaper in 2004 described how, after interviewing locals about the legend, she received anonymous phone calls warning her to stop digging. Another claimed that when he visited the supposed site, his car tires were slashed overnight. Whether these incidents were intimidation or coincidence, they added to the aura of secrecy surrounding the investigation. Perhaps the most famous modern expedition came in 2015, when a team of filmmakers funded by a streaming platform set out to document the legend. They spent weeks camping near the supposed site, interviewing locals, historians, and paranormal researchers. Their footage, later released in a limited series, revealed unsettling moments, a compass spinning erratically, strange lights flickering in the woods, whispered voices caught on audio. The climax of their investigation came on their final night, when multiple crew members swore they saw a procession of lanterns moving through the trees. The cameras caught only faint glimmers, but the witnesses insisted the lights were real. The series ended not with answers, but with a lingering sense of dread. For viewers, it cemented the town's legend as one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. Despite decades of effort, no modern investigation has cracked the case. Every expedition returns with the same pattern: fragments, whispers, malfunctions, and fear. No bones have been unearthed, no mass graves uncovered, no definitive ruins located. The land itself seems to resist being read, as though the very soil conspires to keep its secrets. Even satellite imagery offers little clarity. Some researchers claim to see faint grid patterns in aerial photos, evidence of streets and plots long overgrown. Others argue these are natural formations, nothing more. And yet the persistence of investigators speaks to something deeper than curiosity. The vanished town represents a hole in the fabric of history, a reminder that even in an age of data and archives, entire communities can slip into shadow. For paranormal teams, it is proof that the past is never truly gone. For journalists, it is a story too strange to ignore. For historians, it is a haunting challenge to the very idea of recorded memory. Some modern researchers have begun to theorize that the mystery endures precisely because it cannot be solved. They argue the town's disappearance has taken on the qualities of myth: unsolvable, shifting, eternal. Any expedition, no matter how thorough, will return empty-handed, because the town no longer exists in the way we understand existence. It is not just gone, it is erased, and erasure leaves nothing to recover. Still, investigations continue. Every year, new hikers venture into the woods, new paranormal teams set up equipment, new journalists file stories. Some come back shaken, others disappointed, a few convinced they brushed against something unexplainable. But all return with the same conclusion: whatever happened in 1872, the land has not forgotten. It holds its silence like a wound, daring us to probe deeper, knowing we will never find the core. In the end, the modern expeditions mirror the experience of the town itself. They come full of life and purpose. They leave in silence and confusion, and their records, like the town's, are often incomplete, fragmented, or mysteriously missing. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the vanished town, not what happened in 1872, but the endless pursuit of an answer that may never come. If folklore and eyewitness accounts give the story its ghostly heart, then conspiracy theories are its shadowy skeleton. For every researcher who suggests the town simply faded into obscurity, there are others who whisper about darker forces, forces that wanted this place forgotten, buried, erased from every map and memory. The strangeness of the records, the hostility faced by journalists, the sheer precision of the erasure, these are not easily explained by natural decline or administrative oversight. To many, they point toward one conclusion: a cover-up. One of the most persistent theories holds that the town's residents uncovered something they were never meant to see. Some believe they stumbled upon ancient ruins, structures or artifacts far older than the settlement itself, evidence of civilizations that predated European colonization. Such a discovery, it is said, threatened powerful institutions, perhaps even the church, who feared its implications for theology and history. According to this theory, the town's sudden disappearance was not abandonment, but eradication, a silencing of those who knew too much. Others claim the town was the site of secret experiments. The late 19th century was an age of scientific ambition and reckless curiosity. Railroads cut through mountains, chemical industries bloomed, and medical research often blurred the line between discovery and cruelty. Could it be that the town became the testing ground for an experiment gone wrong? Some whisper of government involvement, even before federal power was as centralized as it is today. The idea is chilling. that the residents were victims of a failed trial, whether chemical, biological, or even psychological, and that the easiest solution was to erase the town itself. A variation of this theory suggests that the town's disappearance was not merely erased from documents, but actively covered up by those in power. Researchers note how county and state records do not simply lack references, they sometimes contain deliberate contradictions. A census record that should list dozens of families suddenly skips numbers. Maps printed in consecutive years show the same valley, one year marked with neat grid lines, the next year blank wilderness. It is as if someone deliberately rewrote reality. To conspiracy theorists, this is the smoking gun, the evidence of manipulation that proves the hand of a hidden authority. Another theory veers into the realm of secret societies. The late 1800s were rife with fraternal organizations, Masons, Odd Fellows, spiritualist groups, even clandestine religious sects. Some legends suggest the town itself was founded by such a society, intended as a utopian experiment, a place where their rituals and beliefs could unfold in isolation. But if the group fractured, if something went terribly wrong, the society may have had motive to destroy its own creation. They could have dismantled the town, scattered its residents, and struck its name from every document to ensure no trace of their failure remained. Local variations of the legend deepen this suspicion. Some oral histories describe late-night gatherings on the outskirts of town, circles of men chanting by firelight. Others recall rumors of a forbidden book that circulated among residents, containing rites and incantations said to summon powers best left undisturbed. Skeptics dismiss these as fear-mongering tales, but they dovetail uncomfortably with reports of occult symbols found carved into surviving stones, symbols that researchers struggle to explain. To some, this points to a darker reality, that the town's erasure was not a punishment from without, but a collapse from within, consumed by its own secret practices. Government cover-up theories reached new intensity in the late 20th century, when researchers compared the town's story to other documented cases of erased communities. Native American villages wiped from maps after forced removals, mining towns abandoned after disasters, even entire neighborhoods bulldozed and forgotten under the guise of progress. But this case is different. Those communities, however tragic, left behind paper trails and ruins. The vanished town left only silence. This silence, theorists argue, suggests more than negligence. It suggests intent. Some even extend the conspiracy into the paranormal. According to fringe researchers, the town may have been built on land already known for anomalous activity, magnetic disturbances, unexplained lights, whispered voices. Perhaps the settlers themselves reported strange events, drawing the attention of authorities who sought to suppress such knowledge. In this reading, the cover-up was not about industry or secrecy, but about hiding evidence that our world is far stranger than we admit. The disappearance of the town becomes not just historical, but metaphysical, a battle over the control of reality itself. Of course, conspiracy theories thrive on gaps, and this story is full of them. Each missing record, each hostile archivist, each malfunctioning recorder is interpreted as proof of a wider design. Skeptics counter that such thinking only deepens the mystery, without providing answers. But in the absence of concrete evidence, the imagination fills the void, and the more chilling the possibility, the more compelling it becomes. One of the most chilling theories is also the simplest, that the townspeople themselves chose to disappear, not through death or disaster, but through collective decision. Some researchers point to accounts of religious fervor in the years leading up to 1872. Could it be that the community embraced an apocalyptic belief, convinced they were destined to leave this world behind? If so, the erasure of records could have been part of their ritual, a way of symbolically severing ties with the outside world. Whether they perished together in a mass ritual, or vanished into self-imposed exile, their story was deliberately sealed away. For many, the theories blur together into something more ominous, a convergence of human ambition, secrecy, and forces beyond comprehension. The idea that the town was erased because of what it found, what it practiced, or what it threatened suggests not just tragedy, but taboo, something too dangerous for the world to know, something still being hidden to this day. Ultimately, The conspiracy theories tell us as much about ourselves as about the vanished town. They reveal our suspicion of authority, our fear of forgotten knowledge, our fascination with secret societies and forbidden rituals. Whether or not any of them are true, they thrive because the silence of the record invites them. When history is scrubbed clean, the shadows speak louder, and in this case, the shadows speak of cover-ups, cults and conspiracies, possibilities so dark that they feel almost more believable than the idea of a town simply vanishing by chance. After all, towns do not erase themselves. Someone or something had to hold the pen. Legends have a way of surviving long after stone and wood crumble into dust. For the vanished town, its greatest monument is not a ruin or a grave, but the persistence of its story. What began as whispered accounts of a settlement that disappeared in 1872 has now evolved into a cultural phenomenon, a tale that draws ghost hunters, thrill seekers, writers and tourists from far and wide. The town that erased itself may no longer stand, but in the collective imagination it is alive, haunting the borderlands of both geography and memory. The haunting legacy first took hold locally. For decades, nearby residents passed down warnings: never walk the valley after dark, never follow lights in the trees, never listen too closely to the wind. These admonitions, part caution and part superstition, shaped generations. Children grew up hearing bedtime stories about the phantom bell that tolled at midnight, or the procession of lanterns that walked through the woods. Local fairs and schoolyards buzzed with retellings, each detail more dramatic than the last. Even those who claimed not to believe avoided the area at night. Fear, once embedded in a community, rarely fades completely. By the late 20th century, the legend began to attract outsiders. As paranormal television shows gained popularity and dark tourism became a recognized phenomenon, interest in the vanished town surged. Writers included it in compilations of America's most haunted places. Amateur ghost hunters arrived with camcorders, hoping to capture spectral evidence. Road trippers, armed with little more than curiosity and directions scrawled on internet forums, sought out the site as though it were a forbidden pilgrimage. They rarely found ruins or answers, but what they did find was atmosphere. The silence, the heavy air, the uncanny stillness of the valley left visitors with the sense that they had brushed against something uncanny, even if they couldn't name it. Soon, the town's absence became an attraction in itself. Paranormal tour companies began offering night expeditions, guiding curious groups into the woods with lanterns and equipment. The tours combined history with horror, recounting eyewitness testimonies of phantom figures and unexplained lights. Some even staged reenactments, with actors in period dress appearing briefly among the trees before vanishing, to heighten the sense of unease. For participants, it was both entertainment and initiation, an opportunity to step into a legend that blurred the line between truth and performance. The rise of paranormal tourism also brought controversy. Some locals resented outsiders turning tragedy into spectacle. If the town's residents truly perished, should their memory be commodified? Others argued the legend had become too commercialized, its authenticity diluted by ghost hunting gimmicks and souvenir shops selling vanished town t-shirts. But for many, the legend's survival depended on this very transformation. By entering the tourist circuit, the vanished town became immortal, its story guaranteed to echo through new generations. Documentaries, podcasts and YouTube channels further amplified the legend. Investigators shared shaky night vision footage of spectral lights. Journalists interviewed locals who spoke in hushed tones, and storytellers wove elaborate narratives around the town's fate. Each medium added its own interpretation. Some emphasized the tragedy of a community lost, others leaned into conspiratorial angles, while paranormal channels played up the horror. The town became a canvas for fear and fascination, a story that could be retold endlessly without ever being solved. What makes the legacy especially haunting is the way it seeps into culture beyond tourism. Local artists paint ghostly depictions of the vanished settlement. Musicians write ballads about the tolling bell. Novelists set their supernatural tales within its fog-shrouded valley. Even academics, skeptical though they may be, reference the town as an example of folklore's power to outlive fact. In this way, the vanished town has achieved something rare. It is no longer just a mystery, but a myth. Yet the legacy is not purely artistic or commercial. For many who visit, the experience carries genuine weight. Some report overwhelming feelings of sorrow or dread, as though the land itself still mourns its lost inhabitants. Others describe sudden moments of connection, as though the valley briefly revealed its secret to them. For ghost hunters, even inconclusive evidence, an EVP recording of faint whispers, a sudden drop in temperature, feels like validation. For skeptics, the power lies in the legend's psychological grip, how expectation shapes perception, and how fear alters memory. Either way, the result is the same. The vanished town continues to haunt those who seek it. The persistence of paranormal tourism has also raised deeper questions about why we are drawn to such stories. In an era saturated with technology and information, mysteries like this remind us of the limits of knowledge. A blank space on a map, a hole in the archive, a silence in the historical record. These are rare and magnetic in a world where answers are expected at every turn. To visit the vanished town's valley is to encounter the possibility that some things cannot be solved, only experienced. That in itself is its allure. At the same time, the legend feeds into a broader fascination with liminal spaces, places that feel suspended between presence and absence, past and present, abandoned buildings, ghost towns, forgotten cemeteries. These are thresholds, places where time seems to fold in on itself. The vanished town is the ultimate liminal space, not just abandoned but erased, existing only in memory and imagination. Standing in its valley, visitors feel the strange weight of absence, as though the land remembers something it refuses to reveal. Interestingly, the legend has also influenced local economies. While some residents resent the influx of paranormal tourism, others embrace it. Bed and breakfasts offer haunted packages, local diners decorate with ghostly motifs, and bookstores stock regional folklore collections featuring the vanished town. In some ways, the community surrounding the lost settlement has found new life by capitalizing on its mystery. Ironically, the town that erased itself has ensured the survival of its neighbors, but perhaps the most enduring aspect of its legacy is how it blurs the line between history and horror. When tourists walk through the valley at night, lanterns in hand, they are not simply chasing ghosts, they are engaging in a ritual of remembrance. Whether they realize it or not, they are keeping the town alive, ensuring it is never fully forgotten. Every retelling, every expedition, every chilling anecdote is an act of resurrection. The erasure of 1872 has been undone by memory's persistence, and yet, beneath the commercialization and fascination, the legend retains its darkness. For at its core lies a question with no answer. What happened to the people who lived there? Paranormal tourism may keep the mystery alive, but it also risks obscuring the tragedy. Behind the ghost stories and conspiracy theories were real families, real lives, real hopes. Their fate remains unknown, and perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all, that we may never know whether they were victims of disaster, conspiracy, or something far stranger. The vanished town's story, then, is not just about the past, but about how we choose to remember, retell and reimagine. Its haunting legacy is not confined to archives or ruins. It lives in whispers, in tour buses, in glowing screens, and in the imaginations of those who dare to seek it. It is a reminder that history is never fully written, that mystery is a force all its own, and that sometimes the most powerful presence is absence. Every story needs an ending, but the story of the town that erased itself refuses to close. It lingers, like a shadow on the horizon, visible but unreachable, present but never solid. For all the theories, the investigations, the eyewitness accounts, the legend remains unsolved. Perhaps that is why it endures. Mysteries without answers carve deeper scars than those we can explain away. When we look back to 1872, we see only fragments. A name struck from maps, records that lead into silence, families who vanish between one census and the next. And beyond the absence, we see the lingering echoes, bells tolling in empty valleys, phantom lights winding through the trees, travelers glimpsing streets that no longer exist. What should be a historical footnote instead becomes a haunting, A community erased not only in life, but in memory. And yet, memory has proven harder to bury than the town itself. Folklore carried it through the generations, weaving tales of curses, disasters, and conspiracies. Eyewitnesses kept it alive in trembling testimonies, their voices carrying fear across decades. Modern investigators renewed the mystery, their equipment failing, their footage glitching, their courage faltering. Tourists and storytellers turned absence into presence, retelling the tale until the town became more alive in myth than it ever was in brick and timber. So what do we make of it all? One possibility is that the town was a victim of tragedy, a fire, a plague, a collapse of resources, something sudden enough to devastate, something shameful enough to conceal. In this version, the erasure was practical, perhaps even merciful, authorities covering their failure by removing the evidence. History is full of communities destroyed and forgotten, yet the precision of this case, the sheer completeness of its disappearance, feels unlike any natural disaster. Another possibility is conspiracy, that the townspeople discovered or practiced something forbidden, that secret societies or governments intervened. That erasure was not accident, but execution, a deliberate removal to protect secrets that could not be allowed to spread. Theories stretch from plausible to fantastical, but all hinge on one truth. Something about this town was dangerous enough to be silenced. And then there is the possibility we dare not dismiss, that the disappearance was not human at all, that the town slipped into some other reality, fell into a fold of time, or crossed a threshold unseen. Legends of phantom towns, vanishing villages, and cursed lands appear across cultures. Could this valley be one such place, where the laws of the world wavered, and an entire community passed into shadow? If so, then perhaps the lights and voices reported today are not ghosts, but echoes from people still living, just not in our world. Whatever the truth, the vanished town reveals something unsettling about our relationship to history. We like to believe the past is solid, that records and ruins guarantee permanence. But here, we see the opposite. Memory can be cut, maps can be rewritten, people can be erased. History is only as strong as the stories we tell, and when those stories are silenced, all that remains is absence. The town's greatest mystery may not be why it disappeared, but why it was so important to forget. And yet, forgetting has failed. The erasure is incomplete. Each retelling reopens the wound, each investigation defies the silence, each whispered rumor resurrects what was meant to be lost. The vanished town reminds us that history cannot be fully destroyed, only driven underground. Like a root system beneath the soil, it waits, ready to sprout whenever curiosity breaks the surface. There is also a darker reflection, for what happened in 1872 is not unique. Across the world, communities have been erased, not by curses or rituals, but by violence, displacement, greed. Villages wiped from existence, cultures destroyed, names erased. The vanished town, in its ghostly mystery, becomes a symbol of these silenced histories, a haunting reminder of how easily the powerless can be forgotten, and how easily the record can be rewritten by those who hold the pen. Standing in the valley today, whether you are a historian, a skeptic or a seeker of ghosts, you cannot escape the feeling that the land remembers. The silence is too heavy, the air too watchful. It is as though the ground itself resists explanation, holding its secret with a stubborn, almost human will. Perhaps that is why so many leave unsettled, not just because of what they see or hear, but because they feel, deep down, that they are trespassing on something sacred. And maybe that is the final truth of this story. Not the facts, not the theories, but the effect. The way a vanished town continues to haunt us, not with answers, but with questions. What does it mean to be forgotten? What does it mean to be erased? And what happens when a community disappears, not only from the land but from memory itself? The vanished town forces us to face the fragility of memory, the impermanence of records, and the limits of our knowledge. It is a mirror held up to our obsession with certainty, reflecting back only shadows. and in those shadows, we see ourselves, our fear of the unknown, our hunger for meaning, our refusal to let silence have the last word. In the end, perhaps the most haunting element of the legend is not the erasure, but the persistence. The fact that you are hearing this story now, more than a century later, proves that the town did not succeed in erasing itself. Against all odds, it survives in whispers, in nightmares, in lantern-lit tours, in the flicker of screens. It survives in the imagination, which refuses to let it die. And so the town that vanished in 1872 remains, not on maps, not in archives, but in us. Each time the bell tolls in an empty valley, each time a traveler glimpses a street where no street should be, each time someone dares to ask, what happened there, the town stirs. Its people may be gone, its buildings reduced to nothing, but its presence endures like an echo that cannot fade. Perhaps one day, an answer will surface. Perhaps bones will be unearthed, or documents revealed, or ruins exposed. Perhaps the conspiracy will unravel, or the supernatural truth will finally break through, or perhaps not. Perhaps the mystery will endure forever, a hole in history that no one can fill. But until then, the town waits. It waits in silence, in shadow, in the forgotten valley where it once stood, waiting for the next traveler, the next investigator, the next storyteller, waiting to remind us that history is never as solid as we believe, that the past can vanish as easily as smoke in the wind. The town erased itself from the map, but it could not erase itself from memory. And that perhaps is its greatest curse, and its greatest power. Dark history never ends where we expect it to. It trails off into silence, into shadows, into questions that refuse to die. And the story of the town that erased itself from the map in 1872 is no exception. For over a century, it has lingered, half history, half nightmare, an open wound in the landscape of memory. We began with a simple mystery. How could an entire community vanish so completely that its name, its records, and its people dissolved into nothing? And along the way we traced every possibility: natural disaster, mass exodus, conspiracy, secret rituals, even a slip between worlds. Each theory carries weight, each adds to the tapestry, yet none offers closure. The closer we look, the more the town recedes, as if it wants to remain hidden. Perhaps that is the point. Some places are not meant to be explained. Some histories resist resolution. The vanished town may be one such place. A reminder that for all our archives and technology, for all our maps and memories, the world still holds corners we cannot illuminate. And that is what keeps us returning. Not the promise of answers, but the lure of mystery. We are drawn to the blank spaces on maps, to the silences in history, because they remind us of something vital, that we are not in control, that the past can slip through our fingers, that even entire towns can vanish without leaving a trace. But the story does not truly belong to the vanished town. It belongs to us, the ones who keep it alive. Every time a traveler tells of strange lights in the trees, every time a local whispers of the midnight bell, every time an investigator sets up a camera in the valley, the town is reborn. Its erasure fails, its silence breaks, its absence becomes presence again. Maybe that is the town's true fate, not to be solved, not to be forgotten, but to haunt, to live forever in the space between fact and folklore, absence and presence, memory and oblivion. A place that no longer exists, yet never truly dies. So the next time you pass through a forgotten valley, the next time you glance at a map and notice a blank space where a community should be, the next time silence settles too heavily around you, remember this story, remember the town that vanished, and ask yourself what other names have been erased, what other histories have been buried, what else waits in the dark, just beyond the reach of memory. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are not those we invent, but those we cannot explain. And the most haunted places are not filled with ghosts, but with silence. The town that erased itself from the map in 1872 is gone, but in truth, it never left. It lingers, in the land, in the legend, and in us, waiting, watching, whispering, And if you listen closely enough, in the stillness of night, perhaps you too will hear it. The toll of a distant bell, echoing from a valley where no town should be. A reminder that history is never complete, and that some mysteries are not meant to be solved,